Michael Leahy is the author of The Last Innocents, The Collision of the Turbulent Sixties, and the Los Angeles Dodgers, and joins us live here on Sports Talk to begin hour number 2 of the show. Michael, I appreciate the time, and it's pretty amazing when you get into this book, and I was wondering what really made you come up with The Last Innocents, and then I was reading on and realized this was really kind of all the culmination from a long interview you had the opportunity to conduct with Maury Wills.
That's right. It's good to be with you, Steve. I had just finished writing about the 2008 presidential campaign for the Washington Post, Steve, and I really wanted a break from writing about politics and social issues for a while, and I thought there'd be nothing else that would be so much fun as to go back to the land of my youth, Los Angeles, and write a story about a player who I long believed merited selection to the Hall of Fame, and that was Maury Wills, who in 1962, of course, broke Ty Cobb's single-season stolen base record. Maury stole 104 bases that year, became the National League's most valuable player, and really paved the way for a string of fabulous base stealers in the years to come, including Lou Brock, Tim Raines, and Rickey Henderson. So it began there with my story for the Washington Post about Maury. And along the way, I was talking to some of his celebrated teammates, Sandy Koufax and Wes Parker, the great Gold Glove first baseman, and Tommy Davis, the National League batting champion. And I spent so much time with Wills, Parker, and Tommy Davis in particular, and their stories about their on-field, off-field life and the challenges they faced in an era where change was afoot. You had the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, a wave of political assassinations. It was such a turbulent time that I thought that the intersection of this glamorous team that won 2 World Series and what was going on in the world around them would make for a fascinating book.
Absolutely
and
right.
So that's how The Last Innocents began.
And yet it's funny because I know there were not a ton of players, ex-players, that you really had the chance to speak to. You did conduct a lot of interviews, but like Koufax, for example, the interview he gave you was really regarding Wills, and you had mentioned that you kind of used that conversation in the book, but he really didn't want to talk about anything else beyond that because we've all known of Sandy as such a private guy. And it kind of makes me wonder, Michael, as you got deeper and deeper into it, was it hard and challenging knowing that there were probably plenty of key players you would have loved to have spent hours upon hours with, but you just couldn't get that opportunity?
Well, no, really. These players sat down with me. Koufax aside, these players sat down with me for hours and hours, including many of the great Dodger rivals. There were more than 40 players who spoke for this book, and most of them for several hours. And in the case of my 7 principal characters, who include, as you noted, Steve, Wills and Wes Parker, these people gave extraordinary time. Wills, for instance, sat down for more than 25 hours of interviews with me, and Parker sat down with more than 40 hours, and that's documented in the acknowledgments of the book. You referenced Sandy Koufax, who is a famously private man, and of course had never spoken to a journalist for purposes of a book. And as you noted, Sandy did finally speak to me. We had one conversation, and that was the ground rules were that the conversation would be about Maury, who Sandy to this day deeply believes that Maury merits election to the Hall of Fame. And but of course, along the way, Sandy talked about some other things. I think the reason why Sandy chose to talk to me, while in the past not talking to other journalists, was because of his tight friendship with Maury Wills. And to give you an example of that, in 1962, as Maury was getting close to breaking Ty Cobb's single-season stolen base record, he he began receiving hate mail from around the country. This was occurring in 1962. This meant that Maury's record chase was occurring 12 years before Henry Aaron would break Babe Ruth's lifetime home run record. So he was receiving this hate mail at a time that Sandy Koufax was receiving a great deal of anti-Semitic hate mail. So the two men struck upon a novel idea. Each would open the other's mail and sift out the hate mail. And that's what they did. I mean, these were two extraordinarily close teammates who had each other's back. And Sandy Koufax was gracious enough to spend time with me talking about that incident, which was really seminal in 1962, which, of course, was 2 years before the Civil Rights Act, and helping me better understand all the obstacles Maury faced as he was chasing Ty Cobb's record. You know, Steve, 1 week Maury could find himself in 1962 on the cover of a major national magazine, say Sports Illustrated, and the next week find himself denied service at a public establishment, a restaurant, or a bar. So, and many of the African-American players I write about from that era in The Last Innocents faced similar challenges. But, of course, black and white players alike on the Dodgers, on this team winning 2 World Series in the 60s, faced many of the same challenges when it came to bargaining with owners and baseball management. There was no players' union, no player agents were allowed. So players, black and white, were united during the 60s in trying to get a players' union off the ground so they could deal equitably with the owners. So the book, The Last Innocents, explores all that, as well as this glamorous team which beat the Yankees in 4 straight games in the 1963 World Series and beat the Minnesota Twins in 1965.
Michael Leahy with us right now, author of The Last Innocents, as we continue here on Sports Talk. You know, it's interesting because when we remember Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier in baseball and really integrating the sport, some people just had this belief that, well, after Jackie, you had Roy Campanella, you had Don Newcomb, you had all these black players come on the Dodgers, so there must not have been much racism and really inequality involving that team because of what Jackie did. And although, you know, 1962 was just 5 years after Robinson retired from the game, there's no reason to think that, you know, some of the things you just talked about, the hate mail from Maury Wills and being denied service, whether it was restaurants or hotels, it was still very much alive in the 60s, even after Jackie Robinson finished his days as a Dodger.
Right, and, you know, the Dodgers... The Dodgers ownership and management did one thing extraordinarily well, which you referenced just now, Steve. They of course brought Jackie Robinson in the game in the late 40s and fully integrated their team in the early 1950s. And you could look at the Dodgers as early as the 1950s, look out on the field, and often see a majority black ball club on the field. And the Dodgers prided themselves on that. Walter O'Malley, the owner, prided themselves on that. So that was the Dodger management and ownership from that period ought to be lauded for that. On the other hand, the Dodgers were very tight-fisted. It wasn't until after the 1965 season, in early 1966, that a Dodger finally earned as much as $100,000.
Amazing.
Sandy Koufax and Don Drysdale went on a joint holdout, and finally management gave Koufax and Drysdale slightly over $100,000 each. But with regard to race, what you just mentioned, the fact that the Dodgers had integrated their ball club and prided themselves on that, of course, often could not protect African American players once they stepped outside the ballpark. And so in 1964, for instance, the year the Civil Rights Act was passed, there was still segregated housing in Los Angeles. Somebody like Maury Wills, again, could find himself on the cover of a national magazine and then understand driving around parts of Los Angeles that he wouldn't be able to live in certain areas. So these were struggles that African American players had to grapple with at the time, and it would 1965, of course, would bring the Watts riots, and there were Maury had a business. He and a partner had a dry cleaning business on the edge of the riot area, just outside the riot area. And Maury would find himself standing outside his business on hot afternoons during the riots to send signals to anybody who might have a bad idea that this was his business, he wanted it protected, and then he would, after spending hours in the hot sun on a Los Angeles sidewalk, would go out to play a baseball game that night. So, you had these extraordinarily talented men, these all-stars, winning World Series titles, and yet dealing with the same challenges of tens of millions of their countrymen. And to look at what Maury Wills did on the field is amazing, but to imagine how he balanced all that with the challenges he faced off the field is particularly extraordinary. These seven principal characters in this book, Steve, are enormously noble men, and I think that for a journalist, that was the great takeaway. That sure, these were incredible athletes winning World Series during a remarkable time, but you're humbled to see just how nobly they faced all these off-field challenges. I couldn't have been prouder to spend so much time over the last 2 years with such a collection of men.
Was that the toughest part, was trying to choose the seven principal players that you were going to focus the book around? Considering you talked to so many more Dodger players that could have been included, what made you to go for these seven?
Yeah, it's a terrific question, Steve. I wanted people of different backgrounds. Here we have, among my seven principal characters, we have 4 whites and 3 African Americans, which more or less reflected the makeup of the club at the time. I also wanted people of different temperaments, different skill levels, so that you would get a sense of what it was like to be a superstar in the 60s, and also something of a role player and something of a less heralded player. So Sandy Koufax, the immortal left-handed pitcher, arguably the greatest left-handed pitcher of all time. He is the sun around which all the others revolve. Maury Wills, this electrifying base dealer who hopefully will be elected to the Hall of Fame one day. Maury's one of those principal characters. Wes Parker, 6-time Gold Glove first baseman, had a horrific youth, Steve. He grew up in a affluent Los Angeles suburb, a community known as Brentwood, lived among motion picture stars and business titans. His father was a business titan in Los Angeles. So from the outside looking in, Wes Parker's life could not have looked more ideal, but he suffered from emotional and physical abuse in his home growing up. So for Wes Parker, baseball was nothing less than his salvation. So he had a very different challenge than Sandy and Maury. Then you had somebody like Tommy Davis, the National League batting champion, who was hoping to get paid fairly. And you have Cinderella stories. You have Lou Johnson, who had spent nearly all his 20s in the minor leagues, was finally called up to the Dodgers in 1965 and became a World Series hero. And everybody remembers Jeff Torborg as a accomplished major league manager. But before Jeff was a major league manager, he was one of the Dodgers catchers and caught Sandy Koufax's perfect game in 65. He's another principal character. And finally, Koufax's closest friend on the team at the time, Dick Tracewski, a utility infielder who would play a major role in both Dodger World Series titles in 63 over the Yankees and 65 over the Twins. So they are the 7 characters. Their range of experiences during their Dodger days and challenges could hardly have been more different. And it's those differences that I wanted in selecting characters. And I'm just lucky that these 7 men spent time talking with me. Again, I couldn't have been luckier to have this cast of characters.
Michael Leahy's book, The Last Innocents, available now, The Collision of the Turbulent Sixties and the Los Angeles Dodgers. We continue our conversation with Michael here on Sports Talk. You can also like Michael Leahy's Facebook page for The Last Innocents. It'll give you some information on that. The book's been out, folks, for about 2 months. 2 months and getting some incredible reviews around the country, and we're very appreciative of Michael as we here in the All-Star break joining us on the show. A lot of narrative with Vin Scully in this book, Michael, and I think that if you're a fan of the Dodgers, especially knowing this is Vin's last year, that just paints the picture so perfectly because of Vin's ability as a storyteller. Was he ever somebody that you tried to target for a sit-down interview as you were putting the book together?
You know, I didn't, only because, Steve, I knew these 7 players comprised the heart of the book, and I really wanted, to the extent it was possible, to keep the focus largely on them. But there is a lengthy passage in the book, as you noted, about Scully, who was nothing less than the poet, the bard of the Dodgers, of the game. When I was going to games as a child in the 1960s, I would bring a transistor radio with me, as did tens of thousands of other fans at the game, because it felt like theater in the ballpark. It felt like you were going to theater. And Scully was this extraordinary narrator. He made the game come alive, and you just did not want to miss that voice. The Dodgers had only arrived in Los Angeles in 1958, and Major League Baseball was new to Los Angeles, and Scully, more than any other force, built that fan base. Koufax, Drysdale were superstars. Wills was a superstar, but the most important Dodger of all time has been Vin Scully. He is the man who built the fan base. He was the man to whom you would continue to listen when the score was 12-2 in the 8th inning, and it would be 99 degrees in the stadium. He's the only play-by-play announcer, I think, in history, Steve, who would to whom a listener would want to listen to him do a Farmer John hot dog ad. So that's the ultimate praise I can give him. You wanted to hear that voice. You wanted to hear what was next. And a number of people in Dodger management over the years have said that the Dodgers' extraordinary success, which, of course, has culminated in recent decades with 3 million people a year coming to the ballpark, just would not have been possible without Vin Scully.
Absolutely right. Hey, before we let you go, Michael, there was one other character that I found fascinating in the book, and for people that do get the opportunity to pick it up, you'll recognize the last name, but you might not know the relationship, and that is Bob Oswald, the brother of Lee Harvey Oswald, who is pretty, he's spotted throughout that book. Tell me a little bit about what made you decide to put, Bob Oswald in and kind of intertwine him to the story as well.
Right. Well, it's a great question. I did a story many years ago, a newspaper story many years ago about Bob Oswald on the anniversary of the assassination. And Bob and I spent a great deal of time together in Texas over the course of a couple days. And at some point, Bob let me know in a moment that was unrelated to our interview about his brother that he was a big sports fan. And he was a big Cowboys fan. He was a big fan of baseball, particularly the the Yankees in the 1960s, a huge fan of Mickey Mantle. And we had talked about the Yankees and Dodgers on that occasion. And so while I was doing the research for this book, I spoke to him yet again. And Bob had told me how much it meant to him in the 60s, in the aftermath of the assassination, to have sports, to listen to watch, the kind of normalcy that came with watching a great Major League Baseball game or a great Cowboys game was a balm for his spirits, was healing for his spirits. And or whether it was watching a great golf tournament with Bob's favorite golfer at the time,